Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 54, Springing a Mine. Refreshed by sleep, Mr. Bucket rises betimes in the morning and prepares for a field day, smartened up by the aid of a clean shirt and a wet hairbrush, with which instrument, on occasions of ceremony, he lubricates such thin locks as remain on him after his life of severe study. Mr. Bucket lays in a breakfast of 2 mutton chops, as a foundation to work upon, together with tea, eggs, toast, and marmalade on a corresponding scale. Having much enjoyed these strengthening matters, and having held subtle conference with his familiar demon, he confidently instructs Mercury, "Just to mention quietly to Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, that whenever he's ready for me, I'm ready for him." A gracious message being returned that Sir Leicester will expedite his dressing and join Mr. Bucket in the library within 10 minutes. Mr. Bucket repairs to that apartment and stands before the fire, with his finger on his chin, looking at the blazing coals. Thoughtful Mr. Bucket is, as a man may be with weighty work to do, but composed, sure, confident. From the expression of his face, he might be a famous whist player. For a large scale, say 100 guineas certain, with a game in his hand, but with a high reputation involved in his playing his hand out to the last card in a masterly way, not in the least anxious or disturbed is Mr. Bucket when Sir Leicester appears. But he eyes the baronet aside as he comes slowly to his easy-chair, with that observant gaiety of yesterday, in which there might have been yesterday, but for the audacity of the idea, a touch of compassion. "I am sorry to have kept you waiting, officer, but I am rather later than my usual hour this morning. I am not well. The agitation and the indignation from which I have recently suffered have been too much for me. I am subject to gout," Sir Leicester was going to say indisposition, and would have said it to anybody else, but Mr. Bucket probably knows all about it, and recent circumstances have brought it on. As he takes his seat with some difficulty, with an air of pain, Mr. Bucket draws a little nearer, standing with one of his large hands on the library table. "I am not aware, officer," Sir Leicester observes, raising his eyes to his face, "whether you wish us to be alone. But that is entirely as you please. If you do, well and good. If not, Miss Dedlock would be interested." "Why, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet," returns Mr. Bucket, with his head persuasively on one side and his forefinger pendant at one ear like an earring. "We can't be too private just as present. You will presently see that we can't be too private. A lady under the circumstances, and especially Miss Dedlock's elevated station of society, can't but be agreeable to me. But speaking without a word to myself, I will take the liberty of assuring you that I know we can't be too private." "That is enough. So much so, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet," Mr. Bucket resumes, "that I was on the point of asking your permission to turn the key in the door." "By all means." Mr. Bucket skillfully and softly takes the precaution. "Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, I mentioned yesterday evening that I wanted but a very little to complete this case. I have now completed it and collected proof against the person who did this crime." "Against the soldier?" "No, Sir Leicester, not the soldier." Sir Leicester looks astounded and inquires, "Is the man in custody?" Mr. Bucket tells him after a pause, "It was a woman." Sir Leicester leans back in his chair and breathily ejaculates, "Good heavens!" "Now, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet," Mr. Bucket began, standing over him with one hand spread out on the library table and the forefinger of the other in impressive use, "it's my duty to prepare you for a train of circumstances that may, and I go so far as to say that will, give you a shock. But, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, you are a gentleman, and I know what a gentleman is and what a gentleman is capable of. A gentleman can bear a shock, and when it must come boldly and steadily, a gentleman can make up his mind to stand up against almost any blow. Why, take yourself, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet. If there's a blow to be inflicted on you, you naturally think of your family. You ask yourself, how would all them ancestors of yours have borne that blow? You remember scores of them that would have borne it well, and you bear it well on their accounts, and to maintain the family credit. That's the way you argue, and that's the way you act, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet. Sir Leicester, leaning back in his chair and grasping the elbows, sits looking at him with a stony face. Now, Sir Leicester Dedlock, proceeds Mr. Bucket, thus preparing you, let me beg of you not to trouble your mind for a moment as to anything having come to my knowledge. I know so much about so many characters, high and low, that a piece of information more or less don't signify a straw. I don't suppose there's a move on the board that would surprise me. And as to this or that more having taken place, why, my knowing it is no odds at all. Any possible move, whatever, provided it's in a wrong direction, being a probable move according to my experience. Therefore, when I say to you, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, is, don't you go and let yourself be put out of the way because of my knowing anything of your family affairs. I thank you for your preparation, returned Sir Leicester after a silence without moving hand, foot, or feature, which I hope is not necessary, though I give it credit for being well intended. Be as good as to go on, also to take a seat if you have no objection. None at all. Mr. Bucket brings a chair. Now, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, with this short preface, I come to the point. Lady Dedlock, Sir Leicester raises himself in his seat and stares at him fiercely. Mr. Bucket brings his finger into play as an emolument. Lady Dedlock, you see, she's universally admired. That's where her ladyship is. She's universally admired, says Mr. Bucket. I would greatly prefer, officer, Sir Leicester returned stiffly, my lady's name being entirely omitted from this discussion. So would I, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, but it's impossible. Impossible? Mr. Bucket shakes his relentless head. Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, it's altogether impossible what I have got to say about her ladyship. She is the pivot it all turns on. Officer, retorts Sir Leicester with a fiery eye and a quivering lip, you know your duty. Do your duty, but be careful not to overstep it. I would not suffer it. I would not endure it. You bring my lady's name into this communication upon your responsibility. Upon your responsibility. My lady's name is not a name for common persons to trifle with. Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, I say what I must say and no more. I hope it may prove so. Very well. Go on. Go on, sir. Glancing at the angry eyes which now avoid him, and at the angry figure trembling from head to foot, yet striving to be still, Mr. Bucket feels his way with his forefinger, and in a low voice proceeds, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, it becomes my duty to tell you that the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn entertained mistrusts and suspicions of Lady Dedlock. If he had dared to breathe them to me, sir, which he never did, I would have killed him myself, exclaimed Sir Leicester, striking his hand upon the table. But in the very heat and fury of the act he stops, fixed by the knowing eyes of Mr. Bucket, who, with mingled confidence and patience, shakes his head. Sir Leicester Dedlock, the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn, was deep and close, and what he fully had in his mind in the very beginning I can't quite take upon myself to say, but I know from his lips that he long ago suspected Lady Dedlock of having discovered, through the sight of some handwriting in this very house, and when you yourself, Sir Leicester Dedlock, were present, the existence in great poverty of a certain person who had been her lover before you courted her, and who ought to have been her husband. Mr. Bucket stops and deliberately repeats, ought to have been her husband, not a doubt about it. I know from his lips that when that person soon afterwards died, he suspected Lady Dedlock of visiting his wretched lodgings and his wretched grave, alone and in secret. I know from my own inquiries, and through my eyes and ears, that Lady Dedlock did make such visit, in the dress of her own maid, for the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn employed me to reckon up her ladyship, if you'll excuse my making use of the term we commonly employ, and I reckoned her up so far completely. I confronted the maid in the chambers, in Lincoln's Inn Fields, with a witness who had been Lady Dedlock's guide, and there couldn't be a shadow of a doubt that she had worn the young woman's dress, Unknown to her, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, I did endeavour to pave the way a little toward these unpleasant disclosures yesterday by saying that very strange things happened even in high families sometimes. All this and more has happened in your own family, and to and through your own lady. It's my belief that the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn followed up these inquiries to the hour of his death, and that he and the Lady Dedlock even had bad blood between them upon the matter that very night. Now, only you put that to Lady Dedlock, Sir Leicester Baronet, and ask her ladyship whether, even after he had left here, she didn't go down to his chambers with the intention of saying something further to him, dressed in a loose black mantle with a deep fringe to it. Sir Leicester sits like a statue, gazing at the cruel finger that is probing the lifeblood of his heart. You put that to her ladyship, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet. From me, Inspector Bucket of the detective. And if her ladyship makes any difficulty about admitting of it, you tell her that it's no use, that Inspector Bucket knows it, and knows that she passed the soldier, as you call him, although he's not in the army now, and knows that she knows she passed him on the staircase. Now, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, why do I relate all this? Sir Leicester, who had covered his face with his hands, uttering a single groan, requests him to pause for a moment. By and by he takes his hands away, and so preserves his dignity and outward calmness, though there is no more colour in his face than in his white hair, that Mr. Bucket is a little awed by him. Something frozen and fixed is upon his manner, over and above its usual shell of haughtiness, and Mr. Bucket soon detects an unusual slowness in his speech, which now and then a curious trouble in beginning, which occasions him to utter inarticulate sounds. With such sounds he now breaks silence soon, however, controlling himself to say that he does not comprehend why a gentleman so faithful and zealous as the late Mr. Tulkinghorn should have communicated to him nothing of this painful, this distressing, this unlooked for, this overwhelming and incredible intelligence. Again, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, returns Mr. Bucket. Put it to her ladyship to clear that up. Put it to her ladyship, if you think it right, from Inspector Bucket the detective. You'll find, or I'm much mistaken, that the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn had the intention of communicating the whole to you as soon as he considered it ripe, and further, that he had given her ladyship so to understand. Why, he might have been going to reveal it that the very morning when I examined the body. At this juncture, a considerable noise of voices is heard in the hall. Mr. Bucket, after listening, goes to the library door, softly unlocks and opens it, and listens again. Then he draws in his head and whispers hurriedly but composedly, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, this unfortunate family affair has taken air as I expected it might. The deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn being cut down so sudden, the chance to hush it is to let in these people, now in a wrangle with your footman. Would you mind sitting quiet on the family account while I reckon 'em up, and would you just throw in a nod when I seem to ask you for it? Sir Leicester indistinctly answers, Officer, the best you can, the best you can. And Mr. Bucket, with a nod and a sagacious crook of the forefinger, slips down into the hall, where the voices quickly die away. He is not long in returning a few paces ahead of Mercury and a brother deity, who bear between them a chair in which an incapable old man, another man, and two women come behind. Directing the pitching of the chair in an affable and easy manner, Mr. Bucket dismisses the Mercuries and locks the door again. Sir Leicester looks on at this invasion of the sacred precincts with an icy stare. Now perhaps you know me, ladies and gentlemen, says Mr. Bucket in a confidential way. I am Inspector Bucket of the detective. I am, and this, producing the tip of his convenient little staff from his breast pocket, is my authority. Now you wanted to see Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet. Well, you do see him, and mind you, it ain't every one is admitted to that honour. Your name, old gentleman, is Smallweed. That's what your name is, I know it well. The other gentleman is in the preaching line, I think. Name of Chadband, Mr. Smallweed puts in. Once had a friend and brother sergeant of the same name, says Mr. Bucket, offering his hand, and consequently feel a liking for it. Mrs. Chadband, no doubt? And Mrs. Snagsby, Mr. Smallweed introduces. Husband and law stationer and friend of my own, says Mr. Bucket. Love him like a brother. Now, what's up?
Do you mean, what business have we come upon? Mr. Smallweed asked,
a little dashed by the suddenness of this turn. Ah, you know what I mean. Let us hear what it's about, in the presence of Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet. Come.
I was the client and friend of Mr. Tulkinghorn, pipes Grandfather Smallweed. I did business with him. I was useful to him, and he was useful to me. Crook, dead and gone, was my brother-in-law. He was my own brother to a brimstone magpie, leastways. Mrs. Smallweed, I come into Crook's property. I examined all his papers and all the effects. It was all dug out under my eyes. There was a bundle of letters belonging to a dead and long-gone lodger, as was hid away at the back of a shelf in the side of Lady Jane's bed, his cat's bed. He hid all manner of things away, everywheres. Mr. Tulkinghorn wanted 'em and got 'em, but I looked 'em over first. I'm a man of business, and I took a squint at 'em. They was letters from the lodger's sweetheart, and she signed Honoria. Dear me, that's not a common name, Honoria, is it? There's no lady in this house that signs Honoria, is there? Oh, no, I don't think so. Oh, no, I don't think so. And not in the same hand, perhaps? Oh, no, I don't think so.
Here, Mr. Smallweed, seized with a fit of coughing in the midst of his triumph, breaks to ejaculate.
No, dear me. Oh, Lord, I'm shaken all to pieces.
Now, when you're ready, says Mr. Bucket, after awaiting his discovery, to come to anything that concerns the Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, here the gentleman sits, you know.
Haven't I come to it, Mr. Bucket? Cries Grandfather Smallweed. Isn't the gentleman concerned yet? Not with Captain Hardin and his affectionate Honoria, and their child into the bargain? Come then, I want to know where those letters are. That concerns me if it don't concern Sir Leicester Dedlock. I will know where they are. I handed them over to my friend and solicitor, Mr. Tulkinghorn, not to anybody else.
Why, he paid you for them, you know, and handsome too, says Mr. Bucket.
I don't care for it. I want to know who's got 'em, and I tell you what we want. What we all here want, Mr. Bucket. We want more painstaking and search-making into this murder. We know where the interest and the motive was, and you have not done enough. If George the Vagabond Dragoon had any hand in it, he was only an accomplice and was set on. You know what I mean as well as any man.
Now I tell you what, says Mr. Bucket, instantaneously altering his manner, coming close to him. I am damned if I am a-going to have my case spoilt, or interfered with, or anticipated by so much as half a second of time, by any human being in creation. You want more painstaking and search-making? You do? Do you see this hand, and do you think that I don't know the right time to stretch it out and put it on the arm that fired that shot? Such is the dread power of the man, and so terribly evident is it that he makes no idle boast, that Mr. Smallweed begins to apologize. Mr. Bucket, dismissing his sudden anger, checks him. The advice I give you is, don't you trouble your head about the murder. That's my affair. You keep half an eye on the newspapers, and I shouldn't wonder if you was to read somewhere about it before long. If you look sharp, I know my business, and that's all I've got to say to you on the subject. Now, about these letters, you want to know who's got 'em? I don't mind telling you, I have got 'em. Is that the packet? Mr. Smallweed looks with greedy eyes at the little bundle Mr. Bucket produces from a mysterious part of his coat and identifies it as the same. What have we got to say next? Asks Mr. Bucket. Now, don't open your mouth too wide, because you don't look handsome when you do it.
I want £500.
No, you don't. You mean 50, says Mr. Bucket humorously. It appears, however, that Mr. Smallweed means 500. I am deputed by Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, to consider, without admitting or promising anything, this bit of business, says Mr. Bucket. Sir Leicester melancholy bows his head. And you ask me to consider a proposal of £500? Why, it's an unreasonable proposal. 250 would be bad enough. But better than that. Hadn't you better say 250? Mr. Smallweed is quite clear that he had better not. Then, says Mr. Bucket, let's hear Mr. Chadband, Lord. Many a time I've heard my old fellow sergeant of that name, and a moderate man he was in all respects as I ever came across. Thus invited, Mr. Chadband steps forward, and after a little sleek smiling and a little oil grinding with the palms of his hands, delivers himself as follows. My friends, we are now, Rachel, my wife and I, in the mansions of the rich and great. We are now in the mansions of the rich. Why? My friends, we are now, Rachel, my wife, and I, in the mansions of the rich and great. Why are we now in the mansions of the rich and great, my friends? Is it because we are invited? Because we are bidden to feast with them? Because we are bidden to rejoice with them? Because we are bidden to play the lute with them? Because we are bidden to dance with them? No. Then why are we here, my friends? We are in the possession of a sinful secret, and dough we require corn, and wine, and oil, or what is much the same thing, money for the keeping thereof. Probably so, my friends. You're a man of business, aren't you? Returns Mr. Bucket, very attentive. And consequently, you're going on to mention what the nature of your secret is. You are right, you had better do. You are right, you couldn't do better. Let us then, my brother, in spirit of love, says Mr. Chadband with a cunning eye, proceed unto it. Rachel, my wife, advance. Mrs. Chadband, more than ready to advance, has to jostle her husband into the background and confronts Mr. Bucket with a hard, frowning smile. Since you want to know what we know, she says, I'll tell you. I helped to bring Miss Hardin, her ladyship's daughter. I was in the service of her ladyship's sister, who was very sensitive to the disgrace her ladyship brought upon her, and gave out even to her ladyship and we will pause there.